One goal of this podcast is to make sense of the new B Corp standards that are already beginning to shape our community. If you don't already know, the new standards, codenamed the Evolution of Standards, or EOS, are much more rigorous than the existing version of the B Impact Assessment. For this episode, I want to give a hat tip to Charlotte Levitt from B Lab, who made an important point to me earlier this year on this topic. She said, this shift in the standards is not just about what the standards are, but also how the standards are going to work. She said, for example, the human rights impact topic is no longer a list of violations that you have to check the box, but it's more of a process that is stakeholder-centered that you should use to identify what matters to your stakeholders. This episode's important because stakeholder engagement is integrated into each of the 10 impact topics on the new standards. So whether you're looking at how your company is going to do with the new standards as it relates to climate action, fair wages, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, workplace culture, etc., knowing how you're going to do effective stakeholder engagement is really going to help you in each of those areas. So without further ado, please enjoy our episode with Tim Frick on his journey at Mightybytes, his expertise on stakeholder mapping, and some of his thoughts on common challenges with stakeholder mapping and how to address them.
Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the B. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner and worker owner at Lyft Economy, and I'm joined by Emmy Allison, Impact Advisor at Lyft Economy. And we're excited because for our next episode, we have Tim Frick, longtime friend and colleague in the B Corp world. And so for those of you who don't know, Tim is the founder and president of Mightybytes, a digital agency and certified B Corp located in Chicago. He's also a speaker, community organizer, and author of 4 books, including Designing for Sustainability, a guide to building greener digital products and services from O'Reilly Media. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Yes, thanks so much for being here, Tim. Can you tell us about Mightybytes and how you first got involved with the B Corp community?
Sure. Yeah. I started Mightybytes in the late 90s to help kind of nonprofits with technology and just kind of understanding what was going on with technology. But we didn't become a B Corp until 2011. But the mission has kind of always been the same, to help purpose-driven organizations find success using the internet. And at the time that I started the company, there was a big hoo-ha about getting everybody on the internet. And I was seeing that a lot of money and a lot of resources and a lot of time were being thrown at all kinds of ideas in all kinds of places, except where I felt it mattered most, which was at the time nonprofits and organizations really working to kind of change the bad practices of the world. And so when I heard of B Corp certification in 2010 on a climate ride, actually, we had been talking internally at the company about, like, are we better as a nonprofit, in the business model that we have and stuff like that. So when I heard Hardeep Savalia from B Lab talking about what B Corps were, like, the light bulb immediately went off. And I came back from that event and I had lunch with a friend of mine who also owned a business and was like, I just heard about this B Corp thing and I really want to become one. And she's like, hey, I just became one. So I dove headlong into it, and we became the 9th certified B Corp in Illinois. And I think we were like the 430 something totally in the community. And like I said, that was back in 2011, and we've kind of been on this roller coaster rock and roll journey ever since.
Awesome.
So cool.
Thanks, Tim. And, just to frame up why we're having this discussion for folks who are curious. So we thought there'd be 3 main objectives for the episode. So this first idea is we want to give folks a brief introduction to what stakeholder mapping is and why it's important. Second, we want to talk about why stakeholder mapping is coming to the new version of the B Corp standards. And then 3, we want to give you, the listener, a basic walkthrough of the stakeholder mapping process from start to finish. And luckily, Tim is very kind and actually helped me and Emmy walk through a stakeholder mapping process at Lyft Economy recently. And so we can reference some of that work. But, just some of this for those of folks who are listening who are fellow B Corp nerds, stakeholder mapping is coming to the new standards. And it's going to be required that every company that certifies as a B Corp on the new standards has done a stakeholder mapping process and a materiality assessment, which we'll get into. And at the same time, I know there's a lot of B Corps, including us at Lyft, who are like, what exactly is this process and what does it really look like? And so Tim, one of the reasons I knew Tim had known about this is because his article is actually listed as one of the resources under like what is stakeholder mapping on the B impact assessment or the new evolution of standards assessment. And so we're excited to talk to Tim about his experience with stakeholder mapping and ideally to give you, the listener, a better understanding like the what, why, and how to go about doing it. So Tim, can you tell us what is stakeholder mapping?
Sure. I'll give you the kind of boring, dry definition first, and then I'll kind of roll my sleeves up and talk about what it actually really means. So, stakeholder mapping is a set of activities. It's designed to help organizations better understand the kind of material needs of their stakeholders and within their business ecosystem. So, that's a kind of dry Webster's like type definition. Really, in terms of what it actually means, especially for B Corps, it's a workshop or several workshops that you do. It's going to depend on the size of your company and the breadth of the kind of material issues that you uncover in the process. But it's really a set of activities to help you figure out, like you said, the who and what and why of the material issues that are of concern to both the business and its stakeholders. So it's the communities in which it resides, its employees, its customers, the environment, any number of ways that B Lab describes or defines stakeholders. So, we do it because we are a digital agency and human-centered design workshops are a big part of what we do. We offer it in a workshop setting. And, since the pandemic, have been doing these virtually as well. And it starts off with just kind of rolling your sleeves up and putting a bunch of stickies on a whiteboard, as you saw the process that we went through recently, to define who is impacted by the decisions that your organization makes. And then digging more deeply, what are they impacted by? What are the decisions that you need to make? And how can you incorporate their input into your products, services, programs, governance, decision making, that kind of stuff?
It's so cool to hear about how you incorporate stakeholder mapping at Mightybytes. Would love to hear a little bit about that, but also why is stakeholder mapping important and what's sort of in it for other companies?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think for us, we build digital products and services for our clients. And so websites and those kinds of things. For organizations that don't understand who their stakeholders are, it's a great first step towards digging into like who is going to be impacted by this thing that we're about to build. And so it's a great process to go through at the beginning of that. And given that we're talking about B Corp certification and the assessment here, it's also good to do at an organizational level, which is what we focused on when we went through the process with Lyft Economy. But it can be various levels of kind of resolution in terms of like how big you want to think or how detailed you want to think. I found it's helpful to have guardrails on it so that you have some specific places. Otherwise, in the workshop, you can tend to kind of veer off into like, especially if you're talking about like, say, community and different companies define communities in different ways. And you can go down a rabbit hole of conversation of talking about, what the needs and what are the material issues associated with those different ways you define community. And so it helps to have guardrails along the process. For us, a digital product or service is kind of good way to kind of frame the conversation around that. But, organizational governance is also another possibility. In terms of what's in it for B Corps, I think it really helps to make better decisions, to more readily solve stakeholder problems, build better products and services, create stronger relationships, improve customer satisfaction, and of course, improve the social environmental impact of the work that you do.
Very cool. Thanks so much for sharing. I think you should jump in, Ryan. You have, I think,
Yeah.
a different framing for the new standards and all that, Jess.
So maybe I'll read out the new B Corp requirements just so folks listening can get a sense of what are we really talking about. So, we're recording this April 2024, so it may have changed. So check the B Corp website
Right.
and the B Impact Assessment. Or I don't even know if it's called the B Impact Assessment anymore. Who knows? Is it the EOS
Yeah.
assessment or something? So, as it's written, it says the company engaged a minimum of 2 to 5. So, it's a minimum of 2 if you're a smaller company. It's up to 5 if you're a larger, like multinational. It depends on your company size. So, you engage a minimum of 2 to 5 of the following stakeholder groups or their representatives in a materiality assessment to get their input on material topics. So, the stakeholders they list in the assessment are workers of the company or its subsidiaries, suppliers, customers, community in which offices or facilities of the company are located, local or global environment, and civil society organizations. So again, like B Lab is really saying you have to engage these people, not to say people, but different groups in a materiality assessment. And Tim, the word materiality comes up a couple times in this and in other ways in talking about
Sure.
stakeholder mapping. So what is materiality assessment and how is that different than a stakeholder map?
Yeah, I definitely want to trust that. And I also want to just mention, it's a really important distinction to talk about groups versus people because the workshops that we do are workshop based, I should say. And it's really tough to have more than 5 to 10 people in a workshop because they sprawl really easily. And so if you want to have representation of those groups, you have to think really intentionally around what are the workshops that you're going to do? Are you only going to engage workers or are you going to engage workers and suppliers or workers and suppliers and customers? Are they all going to be in one workshop or are they going to be in separate workshops? And I mean, it's really important to be intentional about that because, like I said, you can go down a rabbit hole on some of this stuff. And I think materiality is a perfect example of the rabbit hole that you can go down because a materiality assessment captures kind of the issues of concern between the company and its stakeholders. And so if you're talking to all of those groups that you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of issues that come up, a lot of material issues and the decisions that the company makes are going to affect the stakeholders in different ways. And so, understanding where your guardrails are again and where you want to draw the line is an important part of a materiality assessment. And I think also, we did a bit of a scatter plot exercise, or at least discussed it during our time together. And I think, understanding when you're talking about these issues, are they more, what if the business makes one kind of decision? How is it going to affect stakeholders? Or if it makes another kind of decision, how is it going to affect stakeholders? It could be the pricing of your product or service, for instance. I think that was one of the things that we talked about. And, a rise in prices is definitely going to affect your customers, as will a drop in pricing, and figuring out the balance between what decisions can the business make as an organization, while also making sure that the stakeholders are represented in those decisions and are meant to, like I said earlier, maintain happier and stronger relationships with your stakeholders.
As you're talking about this and you're talking about, you started off with groups versus individuals, and you're talking about how are you going to have some of them in the same room? Are you going to break them out? Maybe we zoom out a little bit. I'm like, how does that work? How do you do stakeholder mapping? Like, where
Sure.
does one begin? And I'm sure we could spend,
Oh, yeah,
hours on this, but I guess
for
a high
sure.
level overview.
Yeah, I think, for us, it's about making sure that we have enough time to do research ahead of time. It's not like you decide to do stakeholder mapping on Tuesday and then you jump right in on Wednesday. When we're talking to our clients, we want to talk about, all right, well, where are they at? What is their understanding of stakeholders? If they are missing key groups that we think they need to have, we want some time to be able to research those key groups and understand who they are and what their potential impact could be. One of the exercises that you do in a stakeholder mapping workshop is this kind of impact or willingness to participate. And so what is the impact of, someone if they were to get involved in this issue? And then what is their willingness to participate in this? And understanding that helps you really get to the meat and potatoes of the issues that you've got. And so being able to do some research ahead of time so you at least have a cursory understanding, you're probably going to go in with a bunch of assumptions about, oh, our customers need this, our employees need that because of these conversations that we've had or because of what we've read or whatever. And so we're all coming in with a certain level of assumptions, and you want to make sure that you can validate or refute those by actually making sure you're bringing their perspectives into the mix.
How do companies identify their relevant stakeholders? What should they be thinking about? What criteria should they be using to define who makes it onto their stakeholder map and maybe who doesn't?
if we're doing this through the lens of the B Corp assessment, I would probably lean on the side of how B Lab and B Corps define their stakeholders, which is the list Ryan read earlier with workers,
Mhm.
suppliers, customers, governments and environment, or civil society organizations, et cetera. I probably would kind of stick with that. If for a product or service, when we're talking about our work with Mightybytes and building a digital product for someone, we're specifically focusing on target users, kind of ancillary users, and then kind of the stakeholders like the environment. Like technology has an environmental impact. So how do we make sure that we roll that into the mix of what we're designing and building and stuff? I think, like I said, for the B Corp assessment, defining stakeholders in the way that B Lab does is probably an important distinction. And also understanding that people are usually at very different points along that journey and understanding who their stakeholders are and why they should care about those issues. And so, if you list off those stakeholders that you just did, some companies are going to be like, yep, we've worked on with all of those and we've kind of figured out all these things. Some other companies are going to be like, we work with two. And some companies are going to be like, I know what my customers want and that's it. Or I think I do.
And I think one of the most exciting parts about the next version of the standards is that B-Lab seems to be a lot more prescriptive about these things this time around.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it is helpful to use B-Labs the way that B-Lab has written the standards. But I think it's also helpful to keep in mind it shouldn't be the limit for how we are talking about stakeholder engagement.
Absolutely. For sure. And B Lab has been very good about improving Jedi and inclusion and these kind of metrics into those things. And for digital products and services, I can't tell you how many times I've been in these kinds of exercises and been like, all right, well, how do you prioritize people with disabilities, for instance, because there's a whole different way of using digital products and services for people with disabilities. And a lot of times it's still not in project specs. It's still not in early conversations or strategic discussions or anything like that. And so that's a perfect example of like the fact that web accessibility, WebAIM is the name of the organization. They did a study in 2023 that said that 96% of all websites that they tested failed basic accessibility tests. So that tells you that almost all of the web doesn't work for people with disabilities. Huge stakeholder group. There's 1 billion people in the world with the disabilities that are impacted by this decision. The entire internet is out there for them to use, but yet they can't use it. And so, like, to me, making sure that we're incorporating those things, because there's oftentimes people that are not being considered in those when we're talking with our clients. And so just making sure we're being as inclusive as we can about that kind of stuff, because there are very material issues that come up here.
That makes a lot of sense and is a great segue. Once these stakeholders are identified, what are some effective strategies for engaging them? How does the nature of the stakeholder influence that approach there?
Yeah, I think if we can refer to the work that we did, we kind of did it as short notice and kind of said, let's just run this process and just as a learning experience for all of us. When we would typically do it for clients, we would want at least one representative from the stakeholder groups we're working with. Now, again, as I said earlier, we could do an entire stakeholder mapping exercise or workshop just for customers or just for suppliers or just for employees or something like that. But at the very least, we want those folks represented in the workshopping experience itself so that their perspectives are included in the co-creation process. And so that's a really important distinction. And another reason why we want to do the research up front is have the time to be able to make sure that we are properly identifying those folks and incorporating them into the mix. That's really important, because once you start getting into identifying the issues, they're going to be the ones that have the best insights, and you're going to be able to come up with the best solutions by incorporating their perspectives into those.
Tim, one thing that comes up for me is the folks listening to this are either existing B Corps or prospective B Corps or some hovering around B Corpness.
Be curious.
And be curious. And they might feel like, why do I need to do this process? Like, I'm literally a B Corp where we consider workers, community, environment. And at the same time, like, I would agree with that person's belief. But I feel like the actual process is much more illuminative, if that's a word.
It really is. Yeah.
And could you speak to that? Like,
yeah,
why
absolutely.
even companies that think they consider this need to do this?
As the person who does business development for my organization, it is single-handedly the conversation I've had the most There's been a great rise in human-centered design thanks to IDEO and other companies over the last 20 to 30 years. However, over and over and over again, I keep hearing from potential customers and clients, oh, well, we know that already, or we don't need to do that, or we don't need to go through that. And I understand that they're trying to do this in the interest of saving money. I totally get that and acknowledge that and respect their decision around that. But a lot of times, it's really the process of osmosis that happens in that experience that really gets everybody to that same level of consensus. Because if you make those assumptions, even if you create a bunch of documentation and you're like, but I shared it with my customers, it doesn't matter. They probably skimmed through it and they probably took away something completely different than another person did. And so the process of actually coming to consensus in a human-centered design workshop kind of way, that collaboration that happens, it is unrivaled as far as I'm concerned. And it's really just, you have to do it. It's, we make it a requirement for anybody to work with us. And initially we have skeptics, but I've yet to find a client who's been like, oh, that was a waste of our time. Like every single one of them comes out being like, oh, we have so many more insights. This is so much more insightful to help us do whatever the thing is that we want to do, build a product, design a service, whatever.
Yeah. And I think from Emmy and I doing it, so just for folks who are listening, Emmy and I were sort of the representatives from Lyft, and we did the process with Tim and his team. And even from that, I was like, wow, one, like you really need to have your team, like, I think in the article you say like it's like 5 to 10, or maybe you could speak to numbers in a second.
Sure,
but then
absolutely.
the other thing is how hard it is, even though I maybe had the hubris of like, yeah, I think I know like what our suppliers might want or what our customers or our environmental partners might want, but having them in the room to say like, no, actually, I actually want this. Like that's a big change. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, and also capital C collaboration right there. I mean, it's really about sharing those ideas because sure, you might know what your suppliers want, you might know what your customers want or whatever, but until you have them in the co-creation process, you're creating those solutions together and it levels the playing field, it strengthens the relationship, it really sets up any kind of project or initiative or effort for success longer term because ultimately especially we do big gnarly complicated tech projects and stuff like that. Some of them go on for 9 months, a year. We've had several projects go on for like 3 or 4 years and stuff, and so communication can break down at any given time during that process. And if you've gone through that process, when I say that process, I'm talking about the process of the digital product creation that's drawn out over several years or months. But when you go through the collaboration process, you immediately have a sense of kinship and it kind of breaks down those barriers between like, I am you and you are, what I mean? You're all kind of in the same boat in terms of like designing a solution together. And that makes a huge difference. It does feel very intangible and touchy-feely at times, but I can't say enough how valuable it is to set up at the beginning, especially at the beginning of a client relationship for us.
Being in the room is much different. And then also, yeah, trying to represent other interests was difficult,
Challenging.
truly.
Yeah.
And speaking of challenges, what are some of the other common challenges that companies face when trying to engage stakeholders, and how can those be overcome?
Yeah, I think numbers and scale. I mean, you were talking about that just a minute ago. I think, first of all, we've had workshops that we've done where suddenly our client wants to bring in 15 to 20 people and things go off the rails very quickly. There are any number of things that can set a workshop off the rails. You want to make sure that you have a really good, strong facilitator and kind of all of those things. But really, when you've got there's a few common things. Swoop and poop. The leader comes in and they're like, nope, that's not a good idea. Or everybody in the room just kind of turns and waits to hear what they're going to say. And so there's that. But then there's also just kind of the numbers game of like usually between 5 to 8, maybe up to 10 people. There's a really good, healthy dynamic in a room. Also, time is a really important thing, time boxing exercises, but also making sure that you're giving people enough time to take a break and cleanse their brain palette, so to speak. And when we do virtual workshops, we typically only do them in 2 to 3 hour stints, kind of sessions. Usually when we were doing in-person workshops, we would do them all day. And we found that like once the pandemic hit with Zoom, that is just not an option. People just zone out by or two or three or so, and then you don't get anything out of them. So I think there's that. But then there's also the bigger the company, the more stakeholders there are to be in the mix. And just talking to 5 to 8 people for a multinational is probably not going to be enough. I mean, it's going to be a kind of long-term, drawn-out game that needs to be played in order to figure out all these things. But I to stand by the value of the workshops. It's just a matter of kind of scaling those things up and down. And then there's probably the last challenge that I'll mention, unrelated to numbers, is some people, I think there's a B Lab like best practice around step up to be heard and then step back to let others be heard. And I think you have to gauge who's in your workshop to make sure that they're comfortable with speaking up, because there's our people that just don't want to say anything in a workshop. And you also, when you call on them, they feel uncomfortable. So you want to make sure that you're gauging that energy in the workshop to make sure that you're able to get the most from folks and that they're willing to be put in their effort and feel heard and seen. I could go on. There's a lot of challenges that come with facilitating workshops, but that's a good start.
I mean, it raises equity considerations, right? So I will admit, going into a stakeholder mapping workshop, even with just me and Emmy, to have me thinking like, well, I can probably speak for these stakeholders, like just problematic, right?
Right.
Even in like it's not like a 5-day workshop, it's like a 2-hour session. And there's also this challenge of like, if you're a business owner or a B Corp leader and you're just trying to like grind out through the day and like get stuff done, like make your sales quotas and just like make sure the lights are on, I think it's probably hard and maybe disorienting to think of like, okay, like, so now I have to get an environmental representative and maybe a supplier representative and someone from the local community, and then like do the scheduling, to, like get everyone like in person, or maybe it could be on Zoom, right? But just get it all mapped into like something. And then it's like, okay, do I prep with these people, or do we just show up and kind of shoot from the hip about like what our thing like, what are your thoughts on like some of that mechanics of like getting the right people in the right seats?
Scheduling for sure is a huge challenge. People's schedules are really, even if you're trying to just do 2 to 3 hour sessions, it's still really challenging to get that. The way that we go through our kind of discovery process at Mightybytes, independent of stakeholder mapping or kind of the individual exercises we do inside of a workshop process, but we'll do a kickoff call, which is just general, a 1-hour call to kind of have a conversation about, all right, we're going to start working together. Here's our process. This is what we do. Tell us a little about you and your goal. I mean, most likely, if we're at this point, we've already read their proposal or their kind of project spec and stuff like that. But the general idea is to have a conversation that is generative and productive. At the end of that, we provide an onboarding survey that has a bunch of questions about very specific things that help us understand where they're at, like whether or not they've got things like brand guidelines and how they're thinking about their customers and all that kind of stuff. And so we'll go through that, and that typically takes an organization a week to 2 weeks to kind of fill that out and get us everything that we need. Then we'll take that information and do
the survey you've created.
Yeah. And we customize it. We have like a set of questions in a bunch of different categories, and then we go in, and if we learn things in the kickoff call or through the proposal process that aren't relevant, we'll pull out questions that we don't need or add new ones and stuff like that. And that onboarding survey is part of that research process I was talking about. It helps us understand context around a lot of things. And then we'll do our own research based on their answers. A lot of times they'll give us like, oh, well, we really like this thing over here, or this organization within our community is doing some really great stuff about X, Y, or Z. And so we'll take all of that and we'll start kind of digging deep into the research around that stuff. And we'll do, just a lot of times it's searching the web and finding competitors and finding websites that they like and just kind of understanding the general context. And that helps us inform the exercises that we're going to use in the workshop. And so that's another, again, 2 to 3 weeks. So a full process can take anywhere from 5 to 6 weeks or more, because we'll do the workshop in the middle of it. But then when we're done with the workshop, we'll do insights and analysis on what we learned in the workshop and create a report with the idea that the report is going to actually drive either the project that we're working on or efforts to engage those stakeholders in this example over time. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges with this whole process, is that, it is a little bit encapsulated. And if you present that report and the client's like, this is great, awesome, and then they don't do anything with that, it's great that you did a project with them, but you're not actually creating the desired outcomes that you want to create. And we're really about like making sure that the outcomes that we're targeting are things that we can actually reach and are tangible. And that requires ongoing due diligence on both parties' parts.
Makes sense. And it sounds like surveying is probably a really substantial part of this process. It sounds like research is a big part of the process for y'all. Are there any specific tools or other techniques that you recommend for running an effective stakeholder mapping exercise?
Sure. Yeah, I think research is important to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative as well. A lot of times in qualitative, we'll do interviews and those kinds of things. In quantitative, we might look at like analytics packages and, for a digital product, especially if we're like looking at where do their customers come from and what pages are converting the best and, that kind of stuff. And so, just making sure that you understand what you're trying to get out of each process and stuff based on the target goals that you have is a really important thing. I'm not sure that quite answered your question.
Yes, and
Good. Yes, and
I know that you're actually the first person to show me the Zoom. Is it called? It's not called Canvas. That's the Slack thing. What's the
the
thing we
whiteboard,
worked
the
on?
Zoom
Yes,
whiteboard. Yeah,
Zoom whiteboards. I've used Google Tools has
Yep.
a version of that, but I would imagine maybe you're using Google Forms. But if are there any like specific tools or other like fun ways that you're going about gathering this information or compiling this information?
Yeah, whiteboards for sure. We were
Mhm.
using a tool called Freehand from Envision for a while, which was a really great tool. It did even had some AI tools for creating like sentiment analysis and stuff like that built into it. I haven't seen that level of stuff in the Zoom whiteboards yet, but I'm sure they'll probably get there. The Zoom whiteboards are really great. And the thing that I like about those is since we do most of our workshops on Zoom now, making sure that we can actually have a whiteboard that people can access and they don't have to like go through 7 hurdles to get to and sign up for an account and blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah. And so like making sure that process is easy and painless and can be done in a minute or two is really important. And then for the research process, we will send out surveys, use things like forms or can't remember the name of, there's a few survey tools out there beyond SurveyMonkey and stuff. And then, we will do qualitative interviews if there's something specific that we want to understand. That usually comes a little bit later in our process
Mhm.
where we'll go through and if we have stakeholders, for instance, in terms of stakeholder mapping, if we have them included in the workshops, and then there's things that we need to clarify, follow-up interviews are really useful. Also, like say we decide, all right, we have a solution based on the things that we just talked about in our stakeholder mapping workshop, and we'll present maybe a prototype or some wireframes or something like that to the stakeholder groups or individual stakeholders and kind of have an actual set of questions that we'll go through to be like, does this represent what we talked about? Is it something that you would use? How can we improve it? Kind of just digging deep in between the lines on figuring out what the best solution is and making sure that their perspective is incorporated.
That's so cool. One day, Zoom is going to be able to do all of those things.
Right?
I
You're
feel like
including your
Zoom has,
taxes and
yeah,
rub your feet and your
yeah,
dishes.
literally schedule all of my things. Yeah,
Yeah,
I feel like there's a new Zoom feature, a very robust Zoom feature, like
right.
every month. I had the pleasure of viewing the recording of a webinar that Lisa Giesenbauer did at Evolution Marketing about stakeholder
Wisconsin. Yep.
mapping. And she made a point to be really specific. And she was like, you must be authentic in all of the communications you have with your stakeholders.
Yep.
How do you ensure that stakeholder engagement, the process is genuine and not just a check the box exercise?
A lot of the research that you can do is like Brian was talking about setting up those scheduling calls and such and just having the kickoff call for us is having a conversation of just kind of getting that face-to-face interaction, even if it is on Zoom, of like understanding, all right, what is it we really want to try to do here? Who is affected by our decision making, that kind of thing. I think it comes out really early in a workshop. You start going through, usually most workshops start with a few introductory slides of like, this is what we're going to try to accomplish and that kind of thing. And you'll notice pretty quickly who is engaged and who isn't and who feels heard and who doesn't. And it's the sign of a seasoned facilitator to, as Lisa Giesenbauer said, be authentic, but then also to make sure that they're modeling that behavior for everybody in the room so that everyone can feel that they in turn can also be authentic. And that's really important because, it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people, especially in
So
business scenarios where people put up walls and they're like, this is my professional self. And so,
Yeah.
this is how I act in a professional setting, and any kind of vulnerability or especially fear of failure, like traditional businesses, especially don't have a culture of learning, or that fear of failure is really, really, really big in a lot of organizations. And that's a huge hurdle for this kind of work.
So imagining a process in the how. So we've talked about getting maybe 5 to 8 or 10 folks. You've got your team together. You've researched the project and like the problem goals. You've done some of this pre-research. You've got a sort of idea of, okay, let's get out as many sort of actors or like stakeholders on a whiteboard as possible. So whether it's customers, community, environment, government, sometimes there's special interest groups or
Right.
et cetera. And then you've put them all out. Like, so now, like, imagine someone's gone through and they've put down like a bunch, maybe like 15 or so sticky notes.
Yep.
And then the next step that we went through is this sort of affinity mapping, or basically trying to get to the grid, the sort of like the X and Y axes
Hmm.
that you spoke about. And can you talk about, like, once you've identified stakeholders,
Yeah.
how do you then move into like, what do I do with this big list of people I just wrote down?
Sure. So affinity mapping is like basically a clustering part of the exercise. And so typically I or someone from my team will do that well, folks like yourselves and who are filling out the sticky notes and being like, this is stakeholder one and here's stakeholder two, and that kind of thing. We'll start clustering them by theme and idea and putting them in little groups of stickies around the whiteboard. And we'll obviously validate that with you and anybody in the workshop to say, all right, do these clusters feel right? Are they grouped around a theme like regional or gender identity or size of company, or whatever the themes are that you decide are important for the workshop exercise? Making sure that there's kind of clusters there that work, and that if you're able to talk to the needs of those groups, that there's some level of commonality there, and just trying to understand that. And then, the grid that you talk about is, you want to, as you're moving, either all of those clusters or one of those clusters as a representative of that theme over onto a grid, you want to ask yourself, all right, if this person were to get involved, what is their willingness to do so? Are they really likely to get involved? And if so, what is the impact if they do get involved? And so you map them on that grid based on those two things. So like, what is the impact and what is their willingness to get involved? And that'll help you understand, all right, these really high impact, very willing to get involved people are going to be a very low hanging fruit when it comes to talking about your project and getting their perspectives and engaging in this work, and kind of engaging them in the co-collaboration process as you go through kind of a longer term project that you're working on. And so, taking the affinity mapping and moving it onto a grid based on impact and willingness to get involved just kind of helps you visually represent where you might want to start first in terms of the long road of engaging all your stakeholders.
Right. So the goal is, you've got this X and Y axis and these 4 quadrants, I guess, around the XY axis. And basically the people in the top right are the key stakeholders who you really want to be spending a lot of your time, energy,
Right.
keeping engaged and keeping them satisfied. I guess one question would be, so once you've got this list and you've got, say, like, 5 post-it notes in the top right, which would be like key stakeholders. You got a couple in the bottom left who are like, yeah, they're like, like
Right.
for Lyft Economy, we use Zoom. So I guess Zoom is a supplier, but like they're probably in the like, we don't really care that
Right,
much about,
right.
sorry, Zoom, don't cut us off. We want your whiteboard. And we're not going to use Zoom email, though. I don't know why they're trying to do that. And then, there's other groups where it's maybe like, we are interested in them, or like there's sort of an interest in being involved, but their influence is lower. And how do you sort of move that then to this idea of like materiality? Because I think
Sure.
what B Lab is eventually trying to nudge us towards is like, now that you've mapped these people,
Yeah.
how are you really identifying the impact on them or not? How
Sure.
are you
Yeah.
keeping
Well,
them
and there's
engaged?
a part of the exercise we did do some voting of like who of these groups are the most important, and kind of doing dot voting based on who's in the sticky groups.
Yeah.
One thing we didn't necessarily do that we often do a lot in persona exercises and stuff like that is what is called a level of confidence rating. So we'll rate something on a scale of 1 to 5. So like if we're really confident in a stakeholder group's needs and stuff like that, we'll maybe score it with a 3 or a 4. If we really, really know them well, it's a 5. If we don't, if we're not, it might be a 0 or a 1 or a 2. And so helping to assign that level of competence, because at the end of the day, you do want to have stakeholders involved in this and stuff like that, but you are also going to probably make some assumptions. It's just the nature of a workshop. You don't have time to stop the workshop and go do the research to make sure that your whatever statement you've made is actually correct or valid. And so it's important to acknowledge where you're making some of those assumptions, and a level of confidence score on a stakeholder group can really help with that. That also can in turn help you identify. I wouldn't do any kind of materiality workshop without stakeholders involved in the workshop. And in fact, I would probably encourage that you have separate workshops for each of your primary stakeholder groups, because you're going to get into some needs that they have and some issues that they have that are going to balance. You're going to need to balance out what your business can do realistically, and what you have the resources to do realistically, and what your stakeholders need. And for those of us who are small service-based businesses, that might be relatively easy to do. But for larger corporations where there's huge supply chains and there's lots of potential challenges in those supply chains, it's going to be a much longer, drawn-out exercise.
So, say you've gathered all of this feedback across these different stakeholder groups. How would you go about integrating that feedback
Yeah, I think
into business strategies
for sure.
and
I think
ops?
that, and that's, you just hit the nail on the head in terms of like what the biggest criticisms leveled at materiality assessments are.
Mhm.
That the organization goes through the great process. They create a scatter plot of issues related to what their business needs are and their stakeholders' needs are. Then they create a fancy little graphic, and they put that fancy little graphic in an impact report at the end of the year. And then nothing ever actually happens to it. And really, the importance of stakeholder mapping and these materiality assessments is to incorporate them long term into business strategy. And so that means regularly reviewing them, not only as a company, but with your stakeholders, going through and setting up meetings or other workshops, extended workshops, where you're bringing up these things again and again and again until they actually become second nature within your organization. And I think that's where that whole idea of the kind of growth mindset and continuous learning, and this idea of failure as a learning opportunity is really, really important, because it's important to have those conversations on a regular basis, and know that you're going to try some things, and there are going to be some safe to try things, experiments that you're going to, do, and not all of them are going to work. And that's okay. They are going to take some resources, but that's also okay.
Yeah. And I think that the impact improvement part of the evolution of the standards is a very key part of the next version of the B Corp standards. It has been to an extent, but like not very intentionally. And now impact improvement is more sort of clearly prescribed. Although I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but it sounds like stakeholder mapping can be a very active part of that impact
For sure.
improvement process. So I look forward to seeing how folks leverage that.
Yeah. And I think companies are just going to have to earmark the time and the resources to engage in it at least quarterly, or maybe biannually. I don't know. But just, do it on a regular basis and make sure that it gets folded into existing annual planning and strategic planning, and that kind of stuff, so that it doesn't get set on a shelf and not touched until the next time you have to certify as a B Corp.
Right,
And I think
precisely.
every B Corp is probably guilty of that in a little bit. There's probably not a
As some,
single B Corp out there that hasn't thought about that exact thing at least once. Like, I don't
as
have to deal with this for another 3 years.
as the person who was reminding folks 1-2 months before the
Yep.
research date.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
What impact would you say does stakeholder mapping have on a company's sustainability efforts and overall business success? You were pointing to some of it earlier. It's like building better products, better services, a better business. But yeah, could you speak more on that?
Yeah, sustainability is one of those magical things where, upon first blush, when people first learn about it, they think about it as this thing, and it maybe is like recycling, or doing something, swapping out your light bulbs or whatever. But the more and more you learn about it, the more you realize it kind of encompasses everything, and that it's this kind of ongoing learning journey that never ends. And that can
Truly.
be really intimidating to people for sure. And I think this process helps with that because it helps you understand what are the issues related to these things that I can do something about. As a business owner, I'd love to make change happen around all kinds of things, but my company only has a certain amount of resources. And in our B Corp journey, we have overextended ourselves in the past. And so we want to make sure we don't do that again. And so
Yeah.
making sure that we understand our own capacity and use these exercises and these workshops and stuff to help us build capacity around this stuff is really to me, the most important thing. Just making sure that it can be used successfully over time.
I hate to go here because it's not what I want to encourage companies to do, but companies may be thinking like, what is the minimum? What is the
Right,
absolute minimum I can do to like meet this
right.
standard? And
Well, yeah, and
yeah, I'm curious for your thoughts.
they outlined it pretty clearly in what you read earlier and stuff in terms of like you need to do at least these things. But yeah, I think there's a concept in digital product development called the minimum viable product, and that tends to ultimately it's a great concept. In practice, a lot of times it means delivering shitty software, to be frank. And I don't advocate for that. I think doing the minimum is great, and the viable word is really important in there of like something that actually is useful and meaningful to whoever your stakeholders are in regards to like stakeholder mapping, for instance. I think that's a really important component is just making sure that it is viable, and if that means spending more time on it and making it less minimal, I think that's a completely valid thing.
Well, and the idea behind minimum viable product or the MVP in
Right,
sort of like entrepreneurial circles or whatever, the idea is that you're constantly improving
right.
that product. You're not just delivering the
Yep,
minimum and then
completely.
washing your hands of it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think there is a lot of room to figure out what works best for certain businesses, especially as they are onboarding a lot of new processes for the evolution of
Sure.
standards, but it is really important to keep in mind that we can always be improving on these processes.
Yeah, but kind of to what I was saying, yes, and I should say to in regards to what I was saying is also there, a lot of those kind of agile practices, and I'm a big fan. Move fast and break things, however, has broken a lot of things. And for technical products, it means that a lot of code doesn't get refactored, a lot of unintended circumstances happen, and then suddenly there's Uber, And it starts off innocent enough, but you're like, all right, we're just going to do this iterative continuous improvement. And oh, by the way, this stakeholder is now in the mix and they're giving us the money. So they're telling us we need to go in this direction. And, those kinds of challenges are real and they're faced every day by business leaders for sure. And so to me, just being intentional about taking a step back every now and again and revisiting all of that and being like, all right, what are the consequences of the work that we're doing here? And is a really important thing to consider.
That's a great point. And at the end of the day, people are on the other end of all these processes
Right.
and surveys and how we're reporting this information. So that's a
Yeah,
great point.
absolutely.
Tim, do you have any examples from either Mighty Bytes or from a client, not to be named, but just from that experience of here's a specific example of a process where there was an actual stakeholder in the room that we may not have maybe thought to include, and like that stakeholder that's maybe not part of the company or represents a different interest gave some advice or provided some feedback that really was super helpful and like maybe changed how a company was thinking about a product or service or your own company?
Sure. The most common example that I can talk about in terms of Mightybytes' own work is that accessibility example I mentioned earlier, where there's just oftentimes it's overlooked and not considered and not even on anybody's radar. Like it's not even unless they're a disability rights advocacy organization. It's just not a thing on their frame of reference and stuff. And so having those conversations early on around accessibility, around the sustainable impact of tech, around kind of the unintended consequences of social media and those kinds of things. I mean, there's in the tech world, there's a whole lot of examples around that. I mean, I think Uber is an example. We mentioned earlier, they set out to democratize access to transportation, but look where they're at now. Like, that changed pretty quickly once money got involved and stuff. And so, I think that there's a lot of examples of that in the startup world. I don't have a ton of them in my own personal experience. And I'd love to think that that's just a great example of why we're so good at what we do. But honestly, it's probably just, I'm not thinking about some, and I'm sure there are some that exist. You can strike that in editing, right?
Yeah, Uber is blacklisted you. You can never
Yeah,
take a
right.
ride from them.
I
Although in
think
Upper Peninsula,
Right,
Michigan, do
right.
they even have Uber up there?
They do not know.
I think Uber, if we're going to continue with that example, is an interesting case study because if they were doing stakeholder mapping at all, ever in the
Right.
process, if they were interviewing a very key stakeholder group like drivers in the beginning, I'm sure the way that they're incorporating the feedback is much different than it is now. And they have really deprioritized that. And it's a good lesson for sure.
Yeah, there's an author, Cory Doctorow, that I follow a lot. I think he's brilliant. He covers tech a lot, and he uses a term called enshittification, and it's basically how tech platforms start off with this idea to save the world, and then gradually they're just squeezing both their users and their suppliers so much that they're just squeezing every last value of dollar out of those organizations. And examples he uses are Google and Amazon and like all the big players, and talking about like how they, like I said, squeeze the value out of, like, for instance, Facebook ads, squeezing the value out of both people trying to advertise on there as well as people trying to view content from their friends, and they're getting kind of inundated with ads that are completely irrelevant to the thing that they're actually trying to do. But I digress.
Indeed. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. We could obviously talk about this for so long, for many, many hours and many days. But to wrap up, could you summarize the key action items you believe are really important for a company conducting its first stakeholder mapping and materiality assessment, probably more specifically for the new B Corp standards?
Sure. Yeah. I think, just making sure you understand who they are, at the beginning. I mean, that seems very obvious, but also it is, as we've talked about in our time together here, a lot of people have assumptions about what they know and don't know, and just kind of be willing to set that aside and be like, you know what, I want to understand what my stakeholders care about, and making sure that that is clear to everybody within my business ecosystem, so that that's a thing that actually happens, and then enlisting them in the process. To me, those two things, like understanding who they are, and really getting a clear understanding of where they're at, and then the issues that they're related to. I mean, those to me are why a business would want to do stakeholder mapping, because again, it could inform your product, your service, your programs, your internal governance. It could inform so many things, and so there's a huge amount of value that comes from that process. So it's worth investing in.
Truly. Absolutely. And do you have any final advice for companies looking to make their stakeholder engagement processes
Make it
better?
fun. I think, I think
Yes.
it's, human-centered design exercises are meant to be interactive and collaborative and fun. And so it's easy to get bogged down in things and overthink things. And it's
Hmm.
important to also, when that happens, to take a step back and go walk around the building, or take a bio break, or get some lunch, or just kind of have a dance break if you need to. We
Yes.
do that a lot in B Corp meetings and stuff like that. It's like we just take a quick little dance break or whatever. And that sounds silly, but there's a lot of research that's been done about, like, if you're trying to solve a vexing problem, one of the
Mhm.
best things to do is not think about it for a while and go, like I said, walk around the block, or take a step back from it, get on the bike, or go for a hike or whatever. And oftentimes while you're on that hike, you'll come back and you'll be like, aha, and the light bulb goes off. And so building those kind of break times into your stakeholder mapping process could be really useful.
So cool. Yes, we are big fans of dance breaks at Lyft
Indeed.
Economy. We dance a lot at Lyft Economy on
Love
screen.
it.
It's quite fun. Yes.
And Tim, last question here is, where can folks go to learn more about your work?
Probably the biggest place is mightybytes.com. We really put a lot of effort into our blog, and have been putting a lot of effort into our blog for almost 20 years now. And so there are a lot of posts on there around stakeholder driven business, around digital sustainability, around sustainability in general, around small business practices, around marketing. We talk about tech, business, marketing, and sustainability over and over and over again on our blog. And so, subscribing to our newsletter or whatever is probably a good way to get involved in that.
Awesome. And
Cool.
for folks who would like to read Tim's article on stakeholder mapping. It's called Stakeholder Mapping, a guide for purpose-driven organizations on the Mightybytes blog. So
Awesome.
Tim, thanks so much for joining. It's been a
Thanks
pleasure.
so much for having me. This is a great conversation. Always enjoy chatting with y'all.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Bee. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, "Hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the Bee. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts." Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.